Hi, welcome to SLOs in the game of Skeeball. My name is Christian Long. I'm a software developer with 3M, but today I'm going to be talking about competitive Skeeball, which I've been playing for over 10 years in Brooklyn, New York, and nationally. I've won 9 championships and 9 scoring titles in various formats, and today I'm going to talk about how I developed my strategy and how SLOs can be applied to your approach to the game. But before we really get started, what is Skeeball? Skeeball is a game that's over 100 years old and is commonly found in arcades and on boardwalks. It's a very simple game where you roll balls up a ramp into pockets on a board with various point values, trying to get the highest score possible after 9 balls. In the arcades, you're usually playing for tickets that you can cash in for prizes. But in competitive Skeeball, you're playing to beat your opponent. The structure of competitive Skeeball is typically a match of 10 games or frames, either 1-on-1 or 3-on-3. A frame is 1 game of 9 balls, and the score sheet looks like kind of what you'd see in bowling. We'll get a little more into what all this is later, but for now, I'll just say that for scoring purposes, we drop the 0 of each frame score, so a 360 is scored as a 36. And after 10 frames, you have a 3-digit score, which is also effectively your average. Now let's talk about goals. What is a good score in Skeeball, and how can we use SLOs to help us improve our score? It depends on your approach, but when starting out, new rollers trying to be consistent and get better generally should just aim for the 40 pocket. We call this middle rolling. You're only rolling up the middle of the lane, and it's the best bang for your buck in terms of risk-reward ratio and consistency for a decent score. A good score for a newer roller would be around 270, which means you're hitting 5 to 7 40s and missing 2 to 4, assuming your misses are 10s, which they often are. Occasionally, a miss can drop into the 20 or 30, but those are basically lucky bonus points. As you get more consistent, 300 is a solid score, which means you're getting 6 to 8 40s and missing about 1 or 2, occasionally more. A top middle roller will average 330 or better, usually missing only 1 or 2 40s, usually only missing 1 or no 40s. 360 is the gold standard for middle rolling. That is when you get all 9 balls in the 40. But SLOs teach us that nothing is ever perfect and that you can't rely on being 100% all the time. A 360 is a great score that is definitely achievable, but is nearly impossible to expect yourself to be able to do this every single frame. So instead, we aim for a more reasonable target. Over time, we can adjust this target as we become more consistent rollers. We can set a per frame goal of hitting at least 6 40s for a 270 plus. A more experienced roller will look to hit 7 out of 9. A top middle roller will be looking to average 8 out of 9 with the occasional perfect 360 frame. We can also extrapolate these goals to an entire match, where we'd hope to hit our average score in at least half the frames, occasionally missing our per frame target, but occasionally going over. Here's a real example of a newer roller's match, who had a 268 average last season. Side note, this is not what an official score sheet looks like. This is my own personal practice spreadsheet that I came up with to add some extra tracking data to. The first row are their frame scores, their scores for each frame. The second row is their running average as the match goes on. The third row that's green is their running total points. The fourth row is their target score for that frame that they need in order to stay on pace to hit the target that they set for themselves, which for this roller, I decided should be a 280, as noted in blue at the end of the fourth row. The fifth row shows how many points they're behind or ahead of the pace to hit their target. I set their goal at 280 because you're always trying to improve on what you've done before, but 270 would be an acceptable score here. They hit 60% of their 40s, which is a little below what they would want, but they were buoyed by a lot of 20s instead of 10s. A little luck never hurt anyone. 5 to 10 of these frames would be considered good, with one of them being a perfect 36. 3 more frames were just off the mark with those 26s, and really only 2 bad frames. All in all, for a 268 roller, this would be considered a good match, successfully hitting their targets of 60% of their 40s, half their frames being good, and rolling over their average. Now let's see what a successful match is for an elite 40 roller looks like. I pulled this match for a 338 average roller from last season, where I set 340 as a reasonable goal, although I'm sure they were going for even more. This person hit 91% of their 40s, which is excellent. 8 of their frames being very good, 5 of those 8 frames being a perfect 36. And the 2 bad frames were still not disasters. This person is nearing the ceiling for what is possible, rolling only 40s. So what do we do when we want to increase our score beyond the limitations of 40s? The first option is to go for 50s, but the risk-reward ratio is very great. And that is a strategy that we don't have time to get into the merits of here. For today's purposes, and because it's the strategy that I use, we're going to talk about incorporating the 100 pocket. Hundos, as we call them, are harder than 50s, but the risk-reward ratio gives you a lot more leeway to miss. Very often, people want to go for them whether they're thinking about the strategy or not. No guts, no glory, right? Rolling hundos is very fun and exciting, but also very volatile. Your floor is much lower and your ceiling is much higher. You could go 0 for 9 and end up with a 90, or you could get 6, 7, 8, or even a perfect 900 score. But scores like these are very difficult to come by, and a perfect frame is extremely rare. Rolling all hundos is very high variance, but there is a strategy that blends hundos and 40s to mitigate risk while still increasing upside, known as hybrid rolling. The basic idea behind hybrid rolling is to get some hundos early in the frame and then switch to the safer 40 to lock up your higher score. And if we don't get those early hundos, but we are confident in our ability, we expect to get them later in the frame often enough to maintain our pace for a higher match score and hit our target. The big question when hybriding is, if you start out with hundos, when do you switch to 40s? Hundo rollers used to tend to hundo till you miss or just hundo out, but that can get you into trouble if you keep missing. And I was looking for a more nuanced approach that could deliver more consistency. Let's look at some quick math. I assume a hundo average of 33%, which I think is about the baseline needed for this strategy. Elite hundo rollers will get close to 40% or even higher if they are very hot. If we only roll hundos at a 33% rate, if we roll only hundos at a 33% rate, we would average a 360 score, which is the same as an extremely rare perfect 40 match. If we switch to 40s on the frames that we get early hundos, we are locking up extra points, and we should expect to not fall behind often. Almost a third of the time, we can expect to hit the first hundo. A little more than half the time, we can get a hundo on the first or second ball, and we're hopefully getting at least 1 out of 3, 70% of the time. But that means about 30% of the time, we won't get a hundo in our first 3 balls, and we'll be playing catch up. And about 2.5% of the time, we miss all 9 balls. But that's okay. A 90 is terrible, but not necessarily a fatal disaster. We can use error budgets to determine how often we fail in a frame, which I'll demonstrate in a minute. This chart shows different permutations for ball-by-ball progressions to safely secure a score of 36 or better. A 42 is my gold star score. Getting the first ball hundo and switching to 40s is a perfect frame for me. It was a light bulb moment for me when I realized how good a 42 was, and all I needed was a single hundo. First ball hundo is like a gift of free points if you're a confident 40 roller. Of course, we know that's only going to happen 30 to 40% of the time, but there are other paths to a 42. Switching to 40s after 2 out of 4 or 3 out of 7 hundos also gets us there. And if we miss our first hundo but get the second and switch, we can finish with a 39, which is still great. And the other paths to catch up to a 39 pace are 2 out of 5 and 3 out of 8 hundos. And if we aren't catching up to a 42 or 39 pace but stick to the hundo, we can end up with a 36, a 27, an 18, or the dreaded 9. So like I said, ideally we're getting that early hundo and switching to 40s every frame, but it's not realistic to expect that. We can use error budgets to determine how often we can tolerate failure, both failure to get the early hundos and failure to get the good frame score. Here is a chart of the ball-by-ball hits and misses from my very first hybrid match. It was a rough start with the 2 18s in the first 3 frames, but I straightened out and was still able to finish with a 370. You can see I was hitting the first or second ball hundos about as often as we would hope, 60% of the time. 3 of those were first ball. In the remaining 4 frames where I was behind, I was able to catch up and save a 36 in 2 of those. In my first season, I had at least 1 18 or 9 in every match and was able to determine what was essentially an error budget of 2 bad frames per match could be tolerated and still come out with a score over 360. If I was failing more than that, my score would slide back to middle rolling range, which isn't terrible, of course, but it isn't achieving our goals and we aren't happy with it. I hope you enjoyed this talk, and I'll see you out on the lanes.